A humble farmer, Amos Hart, spent years saving every dollar to buy a tractor that could save his struggling farm. But when he steps into the dealership, he's mocked, insulted, and humiliated by the arrogant owner, Gordon Ashcroft, in front of everyone. What Gordon doesn't know is that the man he just belittled is a decorated war hero and the savior of his estranged son's life. What happens next will shatter Gordon's pride, unite a community, and spark a movement that no one saw coming. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and don't forget to subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. The sun rose over the fields of Amos Hart's small farm, casting golden light over the rows of corn and the weathered barn that had stood for generations. Amos, a man of few words and steady hands, moved through his morning chores with practiced ease. His boots crunched against the frosted ground as he fed the chickens, checked the fences, and hauled water to the livestock. The farm was his life, his pride, and his responsibility. It wasn't much by modern standards, but it was his, and he worked tirelessly to keep it running. Still, the weight of years spent laboring with outdated equipment was catching up to him. His tools were worn, and his plow horse was old. Every season, the field seemed a little harder to work, the yields a little smaller. Amos knew the only way to save the farm was to modernize, but modernizing required money. Money he didn't have in abundance. For years, he had tightened his belt, skipping small luxuries and taking odd jobs around the county when farming allowed. Slowly but surely, he had saved enough to buy what he needed most: a tractor. That morning, as he loaded up his truck with a small box containing his life's savings, his heart raced with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Today was the day. The dealership in town had just the model he needed, a sturdy, no-frills machine that would transform his fields and his future. As he slid behind the wheel of his old pickup, the engine sputtered to life with a groan, but Amos didn't mind. It had carried him this far. The drive into town felt like a journey to a new chapter in his life. Amos gripped the steering wheel tightly, running the numbers in his head for the 100th time. He'd done the math carefully. He could afford it, barely. The thought of finally easing the physical toll of his work filled him with a cautious hope. When Amos arrived at the dealership, his boots crunched on the pavement as he stepped out of the truck, the box of cash tucked firmly under his arm. He glanced at the shiny rows of machinery gleaming in the sunlight. They looked powerful, efficient, and impossibly out of reach for a man like him. Brushing the thought aside, Amos pushed open the glass door, the bell above it jangling softly. The showroom was a world away from the dirt and sweat Amos was used to. Everything was polished, sleek, and intimidating. Salesmen in crisp shirts glanced at him with indifference, their smiles faltering as they took in his mud-streaked boots and weathered flannel. Amos approached the counter, his voice steady but soft, asking for the tractor he'd been eyeing for months. It was then that Gordon Ashcroft, the dealership owner, emerged. Tall, slick-haired, and sharp-dressed, Gordon took one look at Amos and sneered. His tone was dismissive, his words cutting. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked, loud enough for others to hear. The room fell silent as Amos stood there, gripping the box tighter, his resolve tested but unbroken. The room seemed colder after Gordon's mocking question, but Amos didn't flinch. He met the dealership owner's gaze with a quiet calm, the kind forged through years of hard work and harder battles. "I'm here to buy a tractor," he said simply, his voice steady. He placed the box of cash on the counter, the weight of its contents heavier than it seemed. The moment should have been triumphant, a culmination of years of sacrifice, but instead it felt like a test of his resolve. Gordon leaned over the counter, glancing at the scuffed box before snorting derisively. "Cash, that's cute," he said, loud enough for a couple of younger salesmen nearby to chuckle. "This isn't some backwoods flea market. These machines aren't cheap." His words were like daggers, designed to belittle and humiliate. Amos stood his ground, his expression calm but firm. "I've done the math," Amos replied. "I've got enough to cover it." He gestured to the display floor where the tractor he'd been eyeing stood gleaming under fluorescent lights. It was no top-of-the-line model, but it was solid and dependable, just what he needed. Gordon didn't bother hiding his disdain. He sauntered around the counter, circling Amos like a predator. "Look, pal, I've got customers lined up who actually fit the kind of image we like to maintain here. You walk in here looking like you just crawled out of a cornfield. You want a tractor? Go rent a mule." His voice was laced with cruel amusement, and the snickers from the younger staff added to the sting. Amos felt the heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Confrontation wasn't in his nature, and he had no interest in escalating the situation. "I didn't come here to argue," he said evenly. "I came here to do business. If you've got a problem with me, fine, but my money's just as good as anyone else's." Gordon's smile faded, replaced by a hard, smug expression. "Not here, it's not," he said, crossing his arms. "We're a premium establishment, and I don't have time to waste on charity cases." He waved a dismissive hand toward the door. "Now why don't you take your little savings box and move along? You're holding up real customers." For a moment, silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. Amos looked at the tractor again, then back at Gordon. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet resolve. Without another word, he picked up his box of cash and turned toward the door. The salesman smirked, and Gordon's laugh echoed behind him, but Amos didn't look back. He walked out into the sunlight, his shoulders squared and his pride intact, even as disappointment weighed on him like a millstone. As he climbed back into his truck, Amos tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The humiliation was a fresh wound, but he told himself that wounds heal. What mattered most was not letting anyone take away his dignity, no matter how hard they tried. As Amos drove back to his farm, the quiet hum of the truck's engine filled the cab, but his thoughts were louder. Gordon's sneering face and the mocking laughter of the salesman played on a loop in his mind, each memory a fresh jab at his pride. He gripped the wheel tightly, his calloused hands trembling slightly, though not from anger. It wasn't in Amos's nature to lash out or dwell on bitterness. Still, the sting of the encounter lingered. He had worked too hard, too long to be treated like that. The sun was sinking lower by the time Amos pulled into the dirt driveway of his farm. He parked the truck beside the barn and sat there for a moment, staring out at the fields that stretched toward the horizon. The land was everything to him, more than just a source of income. It was his legacy. His father had worked this soil, as had his grandfather before him. Amos had done everything in his power to keep it alive, but without the right tools, he was fighting a losing battle. The crunch of gravel startled him from his thoughts. Looking up, Amos saw a familiar figure approaching, David Ashcroft, Gordon's son. He was dressed in a simple flannel shirt and jeans, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. Amos hadn't seen David in years, not since they'd served together overseas. Back then, David had been a scared kid, fresh out of training and struggling to keep his head straight. Amos had taken him under his wing, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. David stopped a few feet from the truck, clearly unsure of how to start. "Amos," he said finally, his voice low, I heard what happened at the dealership." Amos stepped out of the truck, closing the door behind him with a soft thud. "That's so," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. He didn't need or want pity, even from someone like David. David nodded, his expression conflicted. "Look, I didn't know my dad was going to—" He stopped, shaking his head. "That's not the point. The point is, he shouldn't have treated you like that, especially not you." Amos raised an eyebrow, leaning against the truck. "And why's that?" David hesitated, then met Amos's gaze directly. "Because of what you did for me, for all of us." There was weight in his words, unspoken memories of nights filled with gunfire and the heavy responsibility of survival. Amos shook his head. "That was a long time ago, David. We all did what we had to do." "Not like you did," David pressed. "You saved my life. If it weren't for you—" He stopped himself, his voice catching. "You deserve better than the way my dad treated you." Amos studied him for a moment before responding. "It's not about what I deserve, David. I'm just a farmer trying to buy a tractor. Nothing more, nothing less." With that, Amos turned toward the barn, leaving David standing in the same driveway, conflicted and unsure of what to do next. David stood in the driveway, watching Amos walk toward the barn, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light. He felt a mix of guilt and admiration twisting in his chest. Amos had always been that way, quiet, unshakable, and unwilling to take credit for the things he'd done. It was the same stubborn humility that had driven David crazy back when they were serving together. Amos had been a steady presence in the chaos of war, a man whose courage was matched only by his refusal to let anyone glorify it. David sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. He had known coming here wouldn't change much. Amos wasn't the type to hold grudges or demand apologies, but that didn't make the situation sit any better. His father's actions at the dealership were eating at him. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the fact that Gordon Ashcroft had no idea who he had humiliated. To Gordon, Amos was just another poor farmer to brush off. To David, Amos was the man who had pulled him out of a burning Humvee under enemy fire, dragging him to safety with bullets whizzing past them both. Turning back toward his truck, David made up his mind. He couldn't fix the past, but maybe he could do something to set things right. The idea started forming as he drove back toward town, his headlights cutting through the dark. He didn't want to confront his father yet, not until he had a plan. Instead, he stopped at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, grabbing a corner booth and pulling out his phone. He scrolled through old contacts, finding the names of people who had served with him and Amos. Some were local, others spread across the state, but all of them owed Amos in one way or another. David hesitated for a moment before sending out a flurry of messages. They were short and to the point. Amos Hart needs our help. Meet me at the dealership tomorrow. You'll understand when you get there. It wasn't much, but he trusted the bonds forged in the fire of combat to do the rest. As the messages sent, David leaned back in the booth, staring out the window. He knew this wasn't just about Amos. It was about his own relationship with his father, about proving to himself that he wasn't like Gordon. His father had always been a man who measured worth in appearances and dollar signs. David had spent his whole life trying to escape that shadow, and Amos had been one of the few people who had shown him what real character looked like. The next morning, David stood outside the dealership, waiting nervously. Slowly, people began to arrive. First, a man in a worn leather jacket who greeted David with a firm handshake and a knowing nod. Then a woman with a determined look, followed by more and more familiar faces. By the time the sun was fully up, a small crowd had gathered, each person carrying stories of Amos Hart and the quiet heroism that had left a lasting impact on their lives. Back at the farm, Amos went about his usual work, the sting of the dealership fading as he immersed himself in the rhythm of his chores. He didn't have the luxury of dwelling on what had happened. There were animals to feed, fences to mend, and rows of crops to tend. Each task was a reminder of why he couldn't give up. The land depended on him, and he wouldn't let it down, no matter how hard things got. Yet, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, he noticed more visitors than usual passing by on the road. Trucks slowed, faces turned, and a few even waved hesitantly, as if unsure whether to stop. Word of what had happened at the dealership had traveled fast, spreading through the small town like wildfire. Everyone had an opinion. Some were furious at Gordon Ashcroft's arrogance, declaring they would take their business elsewhere. Others shrugged it off, chalking it up to the way things worked. Money talked, and appearances mattered. Amos, however, paid no mind to the chatter. He had no interest in being the center of attention. He just wanted to keep his head down and move forward. By late afternoon, a knock came at his door. Amos wiped his hands on a rag and opened it to find a neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, standing there with a pie in hand. She was an older woman who had known Amos since he was a boy, her sharp eyes filled with a mix of concern and indignation. "Heard about what happened," she said, pushing the pie into his hands before he could refuse it. "It's a disgrace, is what it is. That man's got no right to treat you like that." Amos sighed, setting the pie on the table. "It's done, Mrs. Reynolds. No use making a fuss over it." But Mrs. Reynolds wasn't having it. "A fuss ought to be made, Amos Hart. People need to know what kind of man you are, the things you've done, not that you'd ever say it yourself." She gave him a pointed look before turning to leave, muttering under her breath about how folks these days don't know respect when they see it. As the evening wore on, more visitors came by, each with their own version of the same message. Some offered money, others volunteered their labor, and a few just stopped to share their outrage. Amos appreciated the kindness, but he refused every offer. "I don't need charity," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I'll get what I need in my own time." Still, the quiet admiration for Amos grew. Stories began to surface, not just about the dealership incident, but about his past. Whispers spread about his time in the military, the sacrifices he'd made, and the lives he'd saved. It was the kind of talk Amos had always avoided, but now it seemed beyond his control. By the end of the day, the humble farmer who had been dismissed and humiliated was becoming something larger than he'd ever intended, a symbol of integrity and resilience. At the dealership, Gordon Ashcroft sat in his office, unaware of the storm brewing outside his carefully polished walls. The morning had been business as usual, showing off shiny machines to well-dressed customers, calculating profit margins, and ensuring that his showroom looked like a place where serious money was spent. To Gordon, appearances were everything, and he prided himself on running an operation that catered to the elite. Farmers like Amos Hart, with their dirt-streaked boots and cash-box savings, were the kind of customers he'd long since decided weren't worth his time. David, however, couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since his visit to Amos's farm. He stood near the showroom entrance, watching as people came and went, the usual rhythm of the day feeling strangely hollow. He hadn't yet told his father about the messages he'd sent the night before, or the gathering he had. He planned. He wasn't sure what Gordon's reaction would be, but he knew it wouldn't be good. His father valued control, and what David had set in motion was anything but predictable. Midway through the morning, the first car pulled into the dealership lot. A middle-aged man stepped out, his demeanor calm but purposeful. He didn't head for the showroom or look at the equipment. Instead, he walked straight up to David and shook his hand. "You're Ashcroft's boy, right?" he asked. David nodded. "I got your message. Where do you need me?" David gestured toward the side lot, where a few others had already begun to gather. More vehicles arrived in steady succession. Trucks, motorcycles, and sedans, each bringing someone who had answered David's call. They came from all walks of life, veterans Amos had served with, neighbors who knew him as a quiet but reliable presence, and even a few strangers who had heard about the farmer's treatment and felt compelled to show their support. By mid-morning, the dealership parking lot was packed, the growing crowd impossible to ignore. Gordon finally stepped out of his office, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion as he surveyed the scene. "What the hell is going on out there?" he barked at a passing salesman. The younger man shrugged nervously. "I think they're here for something to do with that farmer you kicked out yesterday." Gordon's face darkened, and he stormed toward the front doors. Outside, he was greeted by a scene he hadn't anticipated. A line of people stretched along the lot, some holding signs, others speaking quietly among themselves. At the center of it all was David, standing with his arms crossed, his posture defiant. "What is this?" Gordon demanded, his voice sharp. David turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "It's respect, Dad. Something you've forgotten how to give." Gordon's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a man stepped forward from the crowd. "We're here for Amos Hart," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "The man you thought wasn't worth your time." The crowd grew quiet, all eyes on Gordon. For the first time, the dealership owner looked uneasy, the weight of his actions beginning to press down on him in a way he couldn't ignore. Amos was out in the field when he first heard about the gathering at the dealership. A neighbor passing by on the road had stopped to tell him, his face flushed with excitement. "You won't believe it," the man said. "There's a crowd down at Ashcroft's. They're there for you, Amos. People from all over, standing up for what happened." Amos paused, leaning on the handle of his hoe. "For me?" he asked, his tone more incredulous than curious. He didn't understand why anyone would go out of their way for something that, in his mind, was done and over. The neighbor nodded enthusiastically, but Amos just shook his head. "I didn't ask for any of that," he said. "I've got work to do." He went back to tending his crops, but his mind lingered on the thought. By mid-afternoon, another visitor arrived. This time, it was David. Amos heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel and looked up to see the younger man stepping out of his truck, his expression a mix of determination and apology. "Amos," David called as he approached, "you need to come into town." Amos wiped the sweat from his brow and met him halfway, frowning. "I don't need to go anywhere," he said firmly. "Whatever's happening at the dealership has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with you," David insisted. "Look, I know you didn't ask for this, but people care, Amos. They care about how you were treated, and it's not just about yesterday, it's about the kind of man you are. The kind of man people want to stand behind." Amos studied David's face for a long moment, his gaze searching. He saw sincerity there, a sense of urgency that wasn't easily dismissed. Finally, he let out a slow sigh and nodded. "Fine," he said, "but I'm not making any speeches." David smiled, relief washing over him. "That's all right," he said. "You just being there will be enough." When Amos arrived at the dealership, he was stunned by what he saw. The parking lot was packed with vehicles, and a large crowd had gathered, their voices rising in solidarity. Signs held high bore messages like, "Respect every farmer and honor the hands that feed us." Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk, creating a powerful and united front. As Amos stepped out of the truck, the crowd turned to look at him, their conversations falling silent. The attention made Amos uncomfortable, but he held his head high and walked toward the center of the gathering. People began to clap, first a few, then more, until the entire crowd was applauding. Amos looked at David, his expression unreadable. "What's all this for?" he asked quietly. David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's for you, Amos, for everything you've done, for who you are." Amos took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He still didn't quite understand it, but the sincerity of the moment was undeniable. The applause died down as Amos stepped closer to the center of the crowd. He looked uncomfortable, his hands at his sides and his face unreadable. All eyes were on him, but Amos wasn't the type to bask in attention. He glanced at David, silently questioning why he had been brought into this. But before he could say anything, a man from the crowd stepped forward. "Amos Hart," the man said, his voice steady, but loud enough to carry. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding respect. "I don't know if you remember me, but we served together overseas." Amos squinted, recognition dawning after a moment. "Grant," he said, his voice quieter than the man's, but filled with warmth. "It's been a long time." Grant nodded. "Too long. But when I heard what happened here, I knew I couldn't stay away. You saved my life, Amos. Twice, and I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people here who owe you more than they can ever repay." Amos's jaw tightened, his discomfort growing. He glanced at the crowd, noticing others he recognized, people he had served with, people whose lives had intersected with his in ways that only they seemed to remember. He wasn't sure what to say. He didn't see himself as a hero, and he certainly didn't want to be the center of some public reckoning. "I just did what anyone would have done," Amos said, his voice low but steady. Grant shook his head. "No, Amos, you did what you would have done, and that's the difference. You've always been the kind of man who puts others first. It's about time people showed you the respect you deserve." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Amos felt his face flush. He didn't want this kind of attention. He didn't know what to do with it. But before he could respond, another voice rose from the group, a woman's this time. "Amos, you've been helping people your whole life," she said. "You fixed my barn roof after a storm. You lent us your tools when we couldn't afford our own. You never asked for anything in return. We're here because you've earned this." The weight of their words pressed down on Amos like an unfamiliar burden. He had never thought of himself as anything more than a farmer doing his best to get by. All of these people, these faces, these voices, were forcing him to see himself through their eyes, and it was humbling in a way he wasn't prepared for. As Amos stood there, Gordon Ashcroft finally stepped forward from where he had been lingering near the edge of the crowd. His face was pale, his usual smug confidence replaced with something closer to unease. He looked at the gathering, at the signs and the people standing shoulder to shoulder, and then at Amos. For the first time, Gordon seemed at a loss for words, and the silence that followed was heavier than any insult he had ever delivered. Gordon shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the crowd's stares. His usual arrogance was nowhere to be seen, replaced by an uneasiness that seemed to grow with each passing second. He cleared his throat, trying to muster the authority he usually wielded so easily. "Well," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "this is quite the turnout." Nobody responded. The silence was thick, the collective disapproval of the crowd bearing down on him like an invisible force. Gordon glanced at David, who stood with his arms crossed, his expression resolute. He could see it now. This gathering was more than a protest. It was a judgment, and he was the one on trial. Amos, standing near the center of the group, finally broke the silence. "If you've got something to say, Mr. Ashcroft, you might as well say it," he said, his tone calm but firm. There was no malice in his voice, only the straightforwardness of a man who didn't waste words. Gordon looked at Amos, then at the crowd again. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his options. He could double down, dismiss them all, and carry on as he always had. But the faces staring back at him weren't just angry customers or former soldiers. They were the community, his community. And for the first time, Gordon began to realize just how much he had underestimated the quiet power of the man standing before him. Gordon started, then stopped. He took a deep breath and began again. "Mr. Hart, Amos, He hesitated, visibly struggling with the words. "I didn't realize who you were, what you've done, and I was wrong to treat you the way I did," the crowd murmured, surprised by the admission. Gordon's voice grew steadier as he continued, though he still avoided meeting Amos's gaze directly. "You've clearly earned the respect of a lot of people here, more respect than I've shown you. For that I apologize." Amos listened in silence, his expression unreadable. The crowd, however, wasn't so forgiving. A voice from the back, he called out, "Words aren't enough." Others murmured in agreement, their frustration palpable. Gordon flinched but raised a hand to quiet the noise. "You're right," he said, his voice firmer now. "Words aren't enough. I want to make it right." He turned to Amos. "The tractor, it's yours, no charge. Consider it my way of making amends." The offer hung in the air, but Amos didn't move. His eyes locked on Gordon's, steady and unyielding. After a long pause, Amos spoke. "I don't want charity, Mr. Ashcroft," he said. "I came to your dealership to buy a tractor, fair and square. If I'm going to walk out with one, it's going to be because I paid for it." The crowd erupted into applause, their admiration for Amos growing with each word. Gordon looked stunned, unsure how to respond. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this wasn't about money or machinery, it was about dignity. And in that moment, he realized Amos Hart was a man who could not be bought, only respected. Gordon stood frozen, Amos's words reverberating in the air like a challenge he couldn't ignore. The crowd watched him closely, their collective judgment heavy on his shoulders. For years, Gordon had operated his business with a singular focus on profit and image, dismissing anyone who didn't fit his vision of a valuable customer. But now, faced with the unwavering resolve of Amos Hart and the palpable anger of the community, he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling. Amos turned to leave, his stance making it clear that he wasn't interested in continuing the conversation. But David stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Wait, Amos," he said, holding up a hand. "Let's find a solution that works for everyone." Amos stopped and turned back, his expression skeptical but willing to hear him out. David looked at his father, his tone firm but respectful. "Dad, it's time to change how we do things around here. The way you treated Amos wasn't just wrong. It's bad for this town, bad for this business, and bad for us. If you want to make this right, it's not about giving something away. It's about earning back people's trust. Gordon frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion. "What do you propose?" he asked, his tone cautious. David gestured to the crowd. "We start by treating everyone with respect, no matter how they look or how much money they bring through the door. We honor the people who keep this community alive, farmers like Amos, veterans, hardworking families. If we don't, this business doesn't deserve to survive." The crowd murmured in agreement, and even Gordon seemed to realize the truth of his son's words. He nodded slowly, then looked at Amos. "Mr. Hart," he said, his voice steadier now, "if you're still willing to do business with us, I'll sell you the tractor at cost. No markups, no games. It's the least I can do to start making things right." Amos regarded him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Fair's fair," he said. "If it's a good deal, I'll take it." The tension in the crowd broke, and a wave of applause rippled through the group. David stepped forward to shake Amos's hand, a gesture of solidarity and respect. Gordon followed suit, his handshake more tentative but no less genuine. It was clear that this moment was about more than a business transaction. It was a turning point for the dealership, for the community, and for Gordon himself. Amos followed David inside to finalize the deal, the crowd dispersing with a sense of satisfaction. For the first time in years, the Ashcroft dealership felt like a place where everyone was welcome. As Amos loaded the tractor onto his truck, he looked back at the crowd and tipped his hat, his quiet acknowledgement of their support. The cheers that followed weren't for a purchase. They were for the principle that Amos Hart had upheld, one that would resonate far beyond the edges of their small town. The drive back to the farm was quiet, the sound of the tractor securely loaded on the trailer behind Amos's truck, the only noise breaking the stillness. Amos kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind turning over the events of the day. The crowd, the speeches, the confrontation with Gordon. It was more than he'd ever wanted or expected. He'd come to town to buy a tractor, not to become the center of a movement. Yet here he was, driving home with a machine that would change the way he worked, earned not through pity, but through fairness. When Amos arrived home, he parked this truck beside the barn and climbed out, the faint golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields. He stood for a moment, taking it all in, the land he'd spent his life working, the tractor that now represented a hard-won victory. He felt no triumph, no surge of pride, just relief that the ordeal was over and quiet gratitude for the people who had stood by him when he hadn't asked them to. As he unstrapped the tractor and began unloading it, his neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, wandered over from her own property. She leaned on the fence, watching as Amos carefully backed the tractor off the trailer. "Looks like you got yourself a fine piece of equipment there," she said, her sharp eyes sparkling with approval. Amos glanced at her and gave a small nod. "It'll do the job," he said simply. Mrs. Reynolds smiled knowingly. "Word around town is you didn't take it for free. That true?" "It's true," Amos replied, his voice firm but not defensive. "I'm no charity case, and I don't want anyone thinking I'm looking for handouts. All I've ever wanted is to work for what I've got. That's why people respect you, Amos," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice softening. "It's not just what you've done, it's who you are. You've shown this town and that fancy dealership owner what real dignity looks like." Amos didn't respond right away, focusing instead on parking the tractor beside the barn. When he finally turned back to Mrs. Reynolds, he gave her a small, almost shy smile. "I'm just a farmer," he said, "same as I've always been." "That may be," she said, tipping her head, "but you've set an example that'll be remembered." As Mrs. Reynolds headed back to her property, Amos stood for a moment, leaning against the fence and watching the horizon. He hadn't intended to set an example or spark a movement. He'd only wanted to live by the values that had guided him his whole life: honesty, hard work, and respect. If that meant something to others, he supposed that was a good thing. But for him, it was just the only way he knew how to be. With a deep breath, Amos turned back to his work. The sun was setting, but there was still daylight left, and the farm wouldn't tend itself. The story of Amos Hart spread far beyond the boundaries of the small town, carried by the voices of those who had been there to witness it. The crowd at the dealership had recorded videos, shared photos, and written posts online, and within days, the incident became a national story. Headlines praised the humble farmer who stood tall, and clips of Amos refusing charity in favor of fairness went viral. News outlets picked up the story, and soon people from all over the country were talking about the quiet man who had reminded everyone of the importance of respect and dignity. Back in town, the Ashcroft dealership began to see changes. Gordon, humbled by the experience, allowed David to take on a larger leadership role. David implemented a new policy. No matter their appearance or background, would be treated with the same level of respect. The dealership hosted a community appreciation event, inviting farmers and locals to learn more about the equipment they sold, offering discounts and showcasing their commitment to fairness. Slowly, the business began to rebuild its reputation, and Gordon, though reluctant at first, started to see the value of the changes. The movement Amos inspired grew as more businesses across the country adopted similar practices. Some called it the Respect Revolution, a nationwide push for customer service rooted in decency and equality. Amos, however, remained detached from the spotlight. Reporters came to his farm asking for interviews, but he politely declined. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. For Amos, the tractor sitting in his barn was all the resolution he needed. The farm itself began to thrive in the weeks that followed. With the tractor taking over the most grueling tasks, Amos was able to expand his efforts, planting more crops and improving the efficiency of his work. The land responded in kind, yielding some of the best harvests he'd seen in years. His neighbors took notice, often stopping by to comment on how things seemed to be looking up. Amos would nod and offer a small smile, but he rarely said more than, "The land's good to me, so I do my best for it." One evening, as Amos sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he was joined by David. The younger man had taken to visiting occasionally, bringing news about the dealership or just sitting quietly with Amos, enjoying the peace of the farm. This time, David brought a small envelope. "What's this?" Amos asked, taking it from him. "Just a thank you," David said, "from all of us at the dealership for everything." Amos opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter and a voucher for free maintenance on the tractor for the next 5 years. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "Maybe not," David replied, "but it's the right thing to do." As the sun set, Amos leaned back in his chair, watching the fields sway gently in the breeze. The land was his, the work was his, and now the respect he'd earned was his too. It was more than enough.